Hello and welcome to the 2020 virtual edition of Words. I'm Joshua Lambier, the artistic director of the festival, coming to you live from Western University in London, Ontario, which is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. It is my privilege to have the opportunity to host tonight's distinguished guest, poet and author Steven Heighton, who will be joining us to talk about his new book, Reaching Mithymna, among the volunteers and refugees on Lesvos. As we stay home to stay safe, the Words Festival is coming to you, to the safety and comfort of your homes, to bring the brightest writers who are grappling with issues of pressing concern and confronting big ideas. Tonight, we're going to focus our attention on the difficult question of migration and statelessness, on the experience of refugees who have been displaced by global crises, such as war, civil strife and violence, terrorism, and other humanitarian disasters. Our guide into this difficult terrain is Steven Heighton, who has joined us in the past at Words and at Poetry London as an award-winning fiction writer and poet. Tonight, however, Steven joins us to talk about his nonfiction memoir, Reaching Mithymna, which tells the story of his experience on the island of Lesvos, on the front lines of Europe's broken migration system. Since 2015, the island has been home to tens of thousands of migrants and refugees who have been seeking asylum on the edges of Europe, caught in limbo in the overcrowded, depressed conditions of Camp Moria, which was recently, as some of you might know, gutted by fire in September of this year. At the time of the fire, some 11,000 asylum seekers were sleeping rough in Greece's Moria camp on Lesvos. Over the next hour or so, we're going to talk to Steven about his experiences on Lesvos. And we're going to take your questions in chat and on the webinar's Q&A function. So send along your thoughts and questions to join the discussion. In his book on writing, Workbook, Memos and Dispatches on Writing, Steven Heighton confronts William Butler Yeats's insight that we turn our arguments with the world into essays, our arguments with ourselves into poetry. As neat and symmetrical as this equation might be, Steven questions whether this is true of all writers, of his own writing practice in particular. He notes that his arguments with the world, with himself, are, quote, more likely to gel in a form that's neither essay nor poetry. In Reaching Mithymna, Steven brings the lyricism of the poet to bear on the searing images of the refugee crisis, sparked in part but not exclusively by the Syrian civil war. His book exemplifies the power of the literary imagination to interrogate issues of pressing concern, whether in poetry or prose, fiction or nonfiction, or a hybrid mixture that takes some of each to form an engaged writing that seizes our attention to bear witness to events that are changing our world irrevocably right now. It is a pleasure to welcome someone who I and many others consider to be one of Canada's finest writers, both in poetry and prose. Our Words audience will remember Steven's last visit to talk about his novel, The Nightingale Won't Let You Sleep, which has appeared in French and Ukrainian translations and has been optioned for film. Poetry London goers will remember Steven's visit to read from his poetry collection, The Waking Comes Late, which received the 2016 Governor General's Award for Poetry. His short fiction and poetry have received numerous awards, and his reviews often appear in the New York Times Book Review. Steven Heighton, welcome back to London's Words Festival.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me back.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here. I thought I'd start off with a question by recalling one of your memos that you wrote to a younger version of yourself in Workbook, which I mentioned in my introduction. The very first memo you write to yourself is as follows. Interest is never enough. It doesn't haunt you. If it doesn't haunt you, you'll never write it well. What haunts and obsesses you into writing may, with luck and labor, interest your readers. What merely interests you is sure to bore them. I wonder if you could tell us the genesis of your haunting to write Reaching Mithymna. I imagine you've talked about this quite a bit, but maybe you could walk our viewers through what it was that took you to Lesvos in 2015.
Well, in a way, they're two separate questions. What took me to Lesvos was one thing, and it didn't really have much to do with my decision to write the book. I didn't know I'd be writing a book. I figured I'd write something like an article, maybe for the Walrus or the Globe or something like that. Because I'm a writer, I'm bound to write something, or a poem or a short story, and I've written those things as well about what I saw on Lesvos. Um, I didn't know I'd be writing a book, but what happened was 2.5 years later, uh, the situation hadn't changed or improved. I really, perhaps naively, thought that this Syrian civil war would be over by then, and Syria wouldn't continue emptying, and not just Syria, but also Iraq, Afghanistan. Um, 2.5 years after I was there, when I realized it was still happening, I sort of felt I really need to look at the few notes I took when I was there and see if I can write something. And I decided I could. As for why I actually went, that was more a matter of being between drafts of the novel you mentioned before, The Nightingale Won't Let You Sleep, which concerns fictional Mediterranean refugees, but in light of what was actually happening in Greece and the Middle East at that point, the fictional enterprise seemed a little frivolous, or impertinent even. And I just felt I wanted to do something concrete, and I wanted to do something really fast. And to my surprise, I actually did it. Because you get these principled ideas sometimes, and I don't know about you, but I often get ideas like this and I don't follow through. In this case, for a number of reasons that would take too long to explain right now. Though, they worked on me in a matter of hours, but it would take too long to explain. I made the decision basically overnight.
Yeah, one of them I was really intrigued by. This was a conversation with your daughter. You mentioned that in the book. Can you recall that conversation? What was it? You mentioned a number of factors, but that one seemed to be a real catalyst. What was that
Um,
conversation?
I I think I basically told her about my idea. I said, I've gotten this idea that I should go there and do something. And just to put it in perspective, she was 19 at the time and away at university. So I was talking to her long distance, and as I hung up the phone, I thought, uh, right. So she's hearing her old man make principled noises. Let her see you act for a change and actually do something. I mean, that's important, because I think young people often get the feeling that old farts like me are always talking a big fight, talking a good fight, and never doing anything. And so that was one of the things that made me make the decision. Just do it for once, or not for once. The way I was more inclined to involve myself engage directly in activism of various kinds when I was younger, and that's happened less and less as I've gotten older. Common malaise, I think, partly because I've been writing more and more, trying to survive as a writer. But in this case, no, I decided to do something.
Yeah, does she read your work? Has she read the book?
Well, one of my she tried to read my first novel when she was just a book that was completely inappropriate for a 10-year-old. I saw her trying to read it, and I said, I don't know if you should read that. She said, no, I'm curious. And a couple of days later, she hadn't said anything. So I said, well, what do you think? And she said, I'm finding it kind of hard to get into.
Yeah.
So she has read some things I've written. Actually, her boyfriend reads everything, right, and she doesn't, and I think that's interesting. And I'm not bothered by it. There's a sense in which she's carving a path very different for herself. The children of artists often feel sometimes obliged, sometimes inclined to be artists themselves, and that can be fine, or it can be a matter of feeling the shadow too strongly. It can be all sorts of things. So I can only speak from my own experience. I'm kind of glad she's chosen this other path. She's heard me yelling and screaming in my study and throwing things, and little crumbled up balls of paper fly out the door of my study. She was a child, and I once said to her, "Have you ever had any feeling that you want to become a writer?" I'm hoping no. And she says, "No." So yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great segue to a question I wanted to ask about journeys and pathways. And I was really intrigued by the first word of the title, reaching, which refers to a process or as an actively becoming of reaching for Mithymna rather than say arrival at Molivos. I thought there was also a really intriguing parallel here to the opening word that you make about the etymology of the Greek word for refugee, prosphigas. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly.
Pretty good. Yeah, yeah.
those fleeing forward, I think, is how you describe it. There's a kind of uncertain and aspirational temporality in both, in that reaching and that fleeing toward. And I'm wondering if that process or the title reaching has that relationship or that temporality between the two.
Yeah, I just say, but the etymology of that word, I'm not absolutely sure about this, and I've checked with some extremely fluent Greeks,
Yep.
and they're wondering about it too. But pros generally means towards, pros, and related to our pro, like forward, and figas related to fugue, or the fugee in refugee
Yep.
means flight. So it does seem to mean flight towards something as opposed to flight away from something. And I thought that was interesting because there were moments on Lesvos that were quite uplifting for everyone who was involved, volunteers and refugees. And that was those moments when the refugees were moving forward towards their goal, when they didn't feel stalled and stymied because borders were closing or because we didn't have enough buses or whatever. When there was that forward movement, there was a feeling of, I would say at times, even exuberance.
Mm.
Um, yeah. And now I've forgotten the very end of your question. Can you just
No, and I was just thinking the relationship between the title and that notion of the refugee as having an interesting temporality in the sense that the past is gone and there's a moving forward. And it's never a
yeah,
an arrival. It's a constant becoming, a constant movement forward.
yeah, what he said?
Yeah.
You nailed it. I'm not going to try and improve on that. I think I'm hoping all that is in the title, and of course also chose the name Mithymna, which is the old name for the town. It's called Molivos now. That's what everyone calls it. Mithymna is the ancient name, but it's got myth and hymn in it. So how can a poet resist a name like that? It's a
Yeah,
beautiful, haunting name, I think. Um,
absolutely.
and there's a translation of an Arabic hymn or lullaby, I suppose you could say,
Oh,
in the early part of the book that I'm hoping sends readers back to that place name.
yeah. Really fascinating too that the elements of the book that surprised me the most when I started reading was right from the get go. You're immersed in the action. Like it's the first day you arrive, you get into your lodging and have a chance to sleep. But right afterwards, you're at the captain's kitchen, which is the headquarters of the Refugee Aid Foundation that you'd heard about. But right into the mix, it's the action starts right from there, and you do a remarkable job of capturing that hurly burly. What was it like to move so fast? Did you expect to move so fast into the action when you got there?
Well, no, just because you never expect that. You always expect there'll be some sort of transition. You expect there'll be some kind of training. But, I've likened the situation on the north coast of Lesvos at that point to a war zone, except the danger was all to the refugees, not to the volunteers. I'm not pretending we were being shot at or anything. There was no immediate physical danger for us, but it was like a war zone in the sense that things were chaotic and people were disappearing or volunteering and arriving or going somewhere else or being promoted or were so fast that it was almost like in a World War I trench where you hear people arrive as privates and they're sergeants within a few days because others have disappeared. And there was that feeling of chaos. But I should have expected it more because one of the reasons I went in the first place was I heard volunteers were desperately needed.
Mm.
And I heard there were 70 NGOs there, which was true, and also some volunteer foundations, but there just weren't enough people and the infrastructure wasn't there yet. The refugees had really been coming in at a high rate for about 6 or 7 months, but Greece, as you know, has been broke since 2008, 2009, and there just wasn't enough. So I shouldn't have been surprised that I got thrown right into things. And it was partly a matter of just being in the right or wrong place at that time.
Yeah, and you get the job of registering passports and being on that front side, and that must have just been affecting to see, right on that first second day that you're there, people arriving off of the boats and coming in direct contact.
It was affecting. It, it was affecting, but there was also a sort of dreamlike shock
Mm,
and sense of alarm, and I think that was partly because I was still jet lagged.
yeah.
So there was an oniric quality, a dreamlike quality to everything that was happening. And if that was true for me, I think it was also true for the refugees because they were arriving Many of them had been camped out on the shores of Turkey, sometimes for up to a month, waiting for their chance to come across in these overcrowded, inflatable, or as we call them, deflatable, because they were constantly sinking, dinghies. And there'd be 60 crammed into a single dinghy. That's about 3 times capacity. The human traffickers would basically push them off. Uh, well, I don't have to go into too much detail about this, but when they arrived, they were always extremely cold because the rafts filled up with water. So many of them were sitting up to their waists in water. And there was just this kind of shock. Some of them, the people whose passports I was taking that first night, had been rescued because their raft had started to sink. The Coast Guard had scrambled a boat and rescued them and brought them in. They were led down off the Coast Guard cutter, and then they walked with surprising sort of confidence and quick. I thought they'd be sort of shambling and exhausted, but they were walking very quickly and purposefully towards us to give us their passports, those who had passports. Um, but I guess what I wanted to say is, if it seemed dreamlike to me, I think it seemed dreamlike to them, partly because here they are. They think most of them think they're in Greece. They don't realize they're on an island and still have to get to the mainland, because that's what the human traffickers told them. But they looked down at me, and I could see they were shocked because I had just been thrown into this job as customs official. I was wearing a fedora, black leather motorcycle jacket, jeans, and boots, and I had an earring. And I'm putting my hand out and saying with like when I said marhaba, welcome in Arabic. That's maybe the one word I'd managed to learn on the flight the night before. And I'm receiving their passports, and some of them were very reluctant to hand them over because they see this guy who doesn't look anything like a customs agent. He doesn't look official, and I think some of them were just nervous. Is this someone? Is this a scam? Is this guy going to steal my passport? So there was, yeah, I think it felt dreamlike for them as well. They were more exhausted. I don't want to suggest jet lag equates to the kind of exhaustion they were feeling.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. You mentioned the war zone. When we think of war zones, we often think in the wartime photography of objects that are left behind. And one of the images that you highlight right at the beginning is that what you thought was life or buoys out in the water, but they were actually the life preservers, which become mountainous piles of these life preservers. That I imagine that image of the life preserver seared into your own mind.
Yeah, and there, when I was there, there was a kind of giant cairn of discarded life preservers. Many of them, by the way, fakes that
Yeah. Can
wouldn't
you
have
explain
floated.
that too? What that fake life preserver
Yeah,
is?
yeah. There were a couple 100,000 in this huge mound garbage pile of discarded life preservers. We also used life preservers to build bonfires on one of the beaches where refugee rafts would come in. That was one of the jobs, was keeping bonfires going in the night. So talk about lack of infrastructure and like Bronze Age technology. We were actually building fires on the cliffs. Well, I wasn't on the cliffs. MSF was on the cliffs building fires. We were on a beach building fires. So again, like kind of Bronze Age technology. Many of the life jackets were fakes. They were sold for usually 10 euros in the markets of Izmir, and they contain things like bubble wrap, sawdust, rags, and it's not that shocking to me. That's just sort of conforms to the basic maths of capitalism. You make money any way you can. So the human traffickers are willing to see children drown so they can make some money. I wish I was more shocked. Obviously I'm upset about it, but I met a young guy who was a youth group leader from Switzerland who was sitting there getting extremely drunk, though he didn't look like the drinking kind, because he had just learned about the fake life jacket phenomenon, and it shocked him. He just couldn't believe it was true. He came from a small town in Switzerland, and I guess he just hadn't encountered what people are capable of.
It's incredible. Another thing I was really struck by too in the early descriptions of your time there was this discrepancy between the feeling that compelled you out the door, the desire to be useful, and that feeling that you describe your first shift at Oxy, the transit camp for refugees after they arrive. You write, I and the other volunteers will repeatedly wake to find ourselves entirely unqualified but
Yeah.
forced to act.
Yeah.
And I thought that tension between feeling forced to act but not having necessarily the skills that might be needed for that particular moment, that feeling must have been something that really produced that ambivalence. But what was that like encountering the front lines with that tension?
Well, Yeah, it was really intense. I mean, as I just mentioned, I had to be a sort of ad hoc customs agent, and I didn't really know what I was doing. But there was no particular danger. Some of the refugees seemed distressed handing their passport to me. But one night I had to be a sort of ad hoc, pop-up paramedic. They just said, "Stay with this woman. She's unconscious. We don't know what's wrong with her. We have to go find the doctor." So I'm in the medical tent, trying to take this woman's pulse and just pulling a blanket over her. And that was frankly terrifying because I'm not a paramedic. I mean, I managed to take her pulse, but that was about all I could do, keep her warm, and just wait. Uh, I guess what we told ourselves is they need volunteers here, so we're filling in a space. We're warm bodies, and we're working hard, and we're doing our best, and that's better than nothing. But it was still distressing. One of the other terrifying moments was, the same night I was a customs agent. I was later designated along with a Spanish volunteer named Pilar to help lead those 60 rescued refugees to a bus rendezvous. Most of the volunteers were somewhere else. They weren't in the harbor that night, so that's why I got thrown into this, and she did. She brought up the rear. I was supposed to lead them after getting directions from a guy who I later learned had only been on the scene for 3 days. Yeah. So he gave me terrible directions. Why? Because he had only led volunteers to the bus rendezvous once. He didn't really know the directions very well, but he said, you can't miss it, basically, as people always do when they give you terrible directions. And I actually didn't get lost. I managed to follow the directions, but I had no idea if I was following them because we went further and further into the dark. And of course, the further we went into the dark, the more I'm thinking, should I stop now and turn back? Are we going the right way? And time just slows to a kind of quantum crawl in moments like that because you think you're going farther and farther away. And in this case, leading 60 cold, hungry, exhausted refugees further and further. I mean, they've already had to be rescued once, and I'm leading them into the darkness. Then the lights of the bus lit up, and just ahead of us, and I realized, okay, we're all right. But there were moments like that all through it, and I will read a short passage, which will give you a sense of some of the chaos in the transit camp where I worked most days. It was good-hearted chaos most of the time. People were working really hard. And the refugees and the volunteers were often really collaborating to make things work. The refugees were very patient. They didn't worry that they weren't being, helped by experts. They just wanted to move forward.
Yeah. And you mentioned you're going to read a passage. Why don't we jump in and?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So this is from about halfway through the book. So the camp is called Oxy. Was called Oxy. It was named after a nightclub that was closed for renovations, and the owner of the nightclub allowed the Starfish Foundation, the one I worked for, or served with, to create a kind of pop-up transit camp. And the guy who ran it, Omar, who was a half Spanish, half Syrian guy, just did a great job in making it a really welcoming, warm, comfortable place, usually for 1 or 2 nights, knowing the refugees would move on to Camp Moria, the camp you mentioned. You mentioned that when it burned down 2 months ago now, 2 months ago, that there were 11,000 people there. Well, they brought the number down because of COVID. The number had been as high as 25,000 in January. And that was 24 acres. So they reckoned it was the most densely populated settlement on Earth at that point. So here's Oxy, which is pretty densely populated itself. And rain is pouring down, and we're trying to get several hundred newly arrived refugees right onto buses to go down to Moria. They haven't been able to stay overnight because we're getting pressure from the NGOs now to get them onto buses and down to Moria as soon as possible, because Moria is official and Oxy is non-official. And of course, officials always want to close down unofficial things. So refugees are emerging out of the tents into the rain. A Dutch film crew is recording everything for a news documentary. The cameraman hunched under a streaming black poncho like a Victorian photographer under a cape. From the base of the lane, the shift foreman, an MFA student from Baltimore named Jaquan, yells something I can't quite hear over the music now thumping out. The Clash, London Calling, but I think he said 2 minutes. The buses are backing into position. I turn to face the refugees. They're getting soaked all over again, and raise 2 fingers. 2 minutes. A man of about 25 stands at the front, a foot away. His blue eyes bulge at me. His red hair, receding at the temples, is plastered to his skull. Trimmed goatee, skin sunburned pink. Among the darker, black-haired Syrians, he looks almost albino. One of the men says something to him, and he, keeping his eyes on my face, replies in Arabic. Then to me, in barely accented English, will there be enough buses? I can't say for sure. I have to raise my voice over the clash, but I hope so. We hope so. Why are you not allowed to say? This is some secret? No, I mean, I'm not sure. You are not sure. He stares, blinking rain out of his eyes. It's pummeling down, dripping off the end of his nose, sluicing in streams off my hat brim. My jacket is damp and heavy. The people behind him look back and forth between us. You're the first fluent English speaker I've met so far, I say. Yes, I am acting as translator on our journey. I've wanted to ask, I say. I hope you don't mind. The crossing, what was it like? A blank look. Then he nods. Good luck was with us. The water was only to our knees. I was scooping with a pail, but some were too afraid to do anything. You weren't afraid? Something gave me strength, he says, for the crossing. At this point in the script, the cut and paste Muslim should praise Allah for lending him strength. This man shows no inclination to attribute his strength or survival to mediation, divine or otherwise. His protrusive eyes look ready to pop from his skull in fury, as if I've done him some personal harm, though I sense he always speaks bluntly, and maybe more so when translating his words. You ask me why I left Syria? No, I say, but, I would ask. I left because my president is trying to kill me, and because ISIL is trying to kill me, and because the Americans, he blinks, eyelids red, as if unconsciously including me in an accusation he is trying not to spell out. The Americans are trying to kill me, and the French are trying to kill me, and now the fucking Russians are trying to kill me. Seeing light and feeling heat, I glance to the side. The camera under the rain poncho is nosing in while a crewman gaffs a small arc light above it. The Syrian looks over, clears his throat with the word enough, and melts back into the crowd. The camera halts, pans away downhill. At the bottom, Jaquan waves a limp, sopping baseball cap and yells up to me, "Let's do it!" The frenzied opening bars of brand new Cadillac rip through the rain as if on cue. I yank back the rope and the refugees start down while I collect their chits, trying to keep count. Probably the Syrian's brief speech was rehearsed, maybe while bailing out the raft during the crossing this morning. Maybe he sensed that his only chance to deliver it was now. Later, while queuing up at European borders, he would be well advised to say nothing. While the refugees flow down the 5 lanes toward the buses, I notice several NGO reps standing around the film crew. There's Andromachi, a social worker from Mytilene, the island's capital, who's on subcontract with the UNHCR. Unlike the regular reps with their various team-logoed rain gear, she is in her light parka and jeans and is sodden, her blonde curls pasted flat. She's the only rep not making a point of constantly, flagrantly passing in front of the camera to log media hits for their brand. She smiles gamely and gives me the thumbs up. I nod back, trying to keep my count. When I look up again, a Dutch NGO rep across the lane is eyeing me from under the sagging brim of a Tilly hat. Can we not turn off this ridiculous music? Her pleading eyes are not unkind, and for a moment I think I see what they see. Oxy's manic make-do informality, the rutted bus lanes bannered with rags, the shingle overhead with its smiley circle like a sun in a toddler's finger painting, the soggy chits, the shriekingly unsuitable playlist, the volunteers in their unmatching civvies. Moments later, just after Joe Strummer bawls, "Jesus Christ, where'd you get that Cadillac?" her wish is mysteriously granted. The music stops, its raving replaced by scores of voices, English and Arabic overlapping, some arguing, "Stop now, man, I think we're over 60, me." No, I counted 55. Jake won. Better count again. And the rumble of buses and the lashing patter of rain on mud. I start recounting and discover a note penciled on a scrap of newsprint. We thank you. The refugees are all handing in chits to make sure they get on the right buses, so that the smiley face I described, that will be above one of the boarding lanes. So if they get the chit with the smiley face, that's where they line up, because they're trying to keep families and villages as well together. Runnels of muddy water are gushing down the lanes. Somewhere Shane calls repeatedly, "Mind your steps, mates." And now, just as randomly as it cut out, the music revives, this time a Bollywood dance medley. Despite the rain and cold, my own discomfort, my concern about the refugees, how can they not be exhausted and hypothermic by now? And my novice fear of fucking things up, the day has become exhilarating, in fact, beautiful. The refugees are clearly pleased, relieved to be making progress. Their feelings are contagious. Young ones high-five me as they stride past. The older men put a hand to their hearts, a gesture I've always loved and now mimic, or else shake my hand and chant, "Assalamu alaikum." A few young men bearing chits for later buses try to push into the queue, but mostly everything clicks along. I'm swaying a little to the Bollywood bass line, in part to keep warm, but also because of the unspoken esprit de corps now encompassing both volunteers and refugees. So there, I hope that gives a sense of the sort of like chaos and immediacy. You're
I'm
trying to do things fast when rain is pouring down, especially.
really glad you chose that passage because when I was reading that, one of the things that I was really struck by is the fact that you captured the rhythm. You captured the embodied feel of that space, that it's chaos at one moment. It's this incredibly impactful and powerful confrontation with a man, as you say, few of them who could speak English, but one that not only could speak English, but had, as you described it, almost like a rehearsed, had something very powerful to say to you. And then, which could, blow you back, but it does blow you back. But then, of course, the music brings you back. You just feel the rhythm of the uncertainty, the chaos of the space.
Hmm. It may not have been rehearsed. I mean, he was certainly very passionate about what he was saying, and who can blame him? But
Yeah,
I thought maybe. But as for the rhythm, that's where the years of working on poems and short stories, always with a view towards like writing as reenaction, where I try to make the sentences sound like what I'm describing rather than describing them. So I've said before that sound is the way I try to make the reader see. Sound is how I try to make you see. I don't think I have a real gift for visual imagery, but I think I can capture sounds through my sentence rhythms, and that can make you feel like you're there as well.
absolutely. One of the other real gifts of having your writerly touch in telling this story is your ability to capture characters. And I actually kind of want to talk about some of these volunteers. And I say characters because sometimes there is a feeling of that character. After we move through the first chapters, we gradually become acquainted with a very international group of what you call heroes and heroines, which I really like. To describe the volunteers, and I actually even thought of even a book like Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what I mean by that is there's the hero has a journey. The protagonist confronts natural or human created disasters that compel themes of ordeals, trials, and survival, which taken together build personal strength and resilience. When you call the volunteers heroes, I hear something different than a colloquial description of the hero. I hear something that is quite literary in character. I hear a description of a group of individuals who are going through their own ordeals, their own journeys, physical and psychological, as they stand on that front line of a refugee crisis. Though each of these characters are real people, I wonder if you did have that idea of a hero's journey as you were constructing the various individuals you met.
Absolutely, and I think when I talk about heroes and heroines, I was talking about the refugees that I was able to talk to, and the volunteers I got to know, and to complete. And I will talk about that personal ordeal, but I want to mention one of the scenes where I try to talk about the heroism of Omar, the man who created this pop-up refugee camp.
Yeah.
I describe him going behind a dumpster. Uh, 800 refugees one night had to sleep beside a dumpster and a little sort of turnaround on the road before they walked 30 miles down to Moria, which they did the next day. Uh, all of them in this Greek summer, 30 miles, including children. Anyway, so that's heroic. Obviously, what Omar did was obviously you get 800 people there, and there's nowhere to to relieve yourself. He had to go behind the dumpster with a garbage bag. He wanted to maintain good relations between the refugees and the locals because he knew the locals were exhausted and the economy was shattered, and he sensed correctly that this was the refugees' arrival was a huge strain on the economy, and some of the locals could become really impatient and make it difficult. Yeah. So he thought to maintain good relations, I'm going to clean up tomorrow morning. So he goes out and he wraps T-shirts around his face, and he goes out with gloves, and he just picks up shit for 3 or 4 hours behind a dumpster. And I said, the word hero doesn't usually come to mind when you think of somebody, kneeling down, picking up shit and putting it in a garbage bag. But to me, what he did was heroic, because he's just getting on with what has to be done. So it's not heroism as in, pulling out your sword and fighting orcs and stuff, which is, can be fun to watch those movies, but it's childish, right? Like it's a childish pleasure. It's not real life, but what he did was heroic. As for people going through their own personal ordeals, I saw it day by day. I was there for 30 days, and I saw some people change a lot just over those 30 days, including Omar, who had already been there for months, including the photographer, Neil McQueen, who's terrific, very powerful, moving photographs are in the book, and a very grouchy guy, quite unpleasant and judgmental in some ways, and yet what a heart, right? Look at those photos. And that's what heroes are. They're human, they're complicated, they can be grouchy and unpleasant and judgmental. They can do jobs like picking up shit, and they're heroes.
Yeah, and
that's what real heroes are instead of in the movies.
Absolutely. And I was thinking of the name for Omar too, Omiros, which, as you point out, is Homer. So there's a connection to almost a kind of Homeric quality to him, the way of almost kind of a returning, not unlike Odysseus, of returning back. And there's a moment in, I think it's a bar, after you've picked up a generator that Antifa has kind of taken hostage. And the scene of you two driving with the kind of oversized helmets on a Vespa scooter with two big gentlemen through is quite extraordinary. But in the bar, there's this moment where you both are kind of bonding in a way to describe almost a motivation to be there. And there's this moment of almost heroic atonement where you are on the verge of asking him about whether his father, who has a Syrian background, whether there's something about that experience that's bringing him back, almost an atonement to come back to these shores. I wondered what it was that stopped you, or what stopped you from asking him about that in that moment.
Yeah, his father had gone out of his life a long time before. I don't remember the details, but so I wondered, like, are you here partly hoping to meet your father on the beach? Not literally your father, you know what I mean, metaphorically. And then I just thought it would be an impertinent question for all sorts of reasons, just too personal, too private. And I wouldn't have wanted someone asking me, are you here because your mother was Greek and, she's dead now, and maybe is there some connection there to it? Well, actually, no, I wouldn't have minded if someone had asked me that, but I wasn't sure how he would feel. And I just thought you have to leave people's inner stories, their personal ordeals, their hero journey, if you want to use that term. You have to leave that mysterious and not try to explain it to them. They will find it themselves, I guess. I'm still sort of trying to figure out mine, but that's part of the journey. It's certainly part of the thing that fuels your art if you're an artist, trying to figure out what your real reasons are, what you really want to serve. So maybe that's why I thought it would be impertinent and I didn't ask the question. And I just want to say one thing about retrieving the generator from Antifa. I thought the Antifa people were great. I mean, right now you're hearing all this, the GOP in the States are trying to use the Antifa as the big bogeyman, if we, where they're going with that. But they were difficult, confrontational, unpleasant people who were doing really great work. And I didn't go there to be liked and to have someone, be really friendly. And they didn't want to give us back the generator because we were going to return it to the Red Cross. Because if we didn't, the Red Cross might not give our camp another generator. Their attitude was they're a big NGO. We've got it now. We're not giving it back. But Omar talked them into it. He was a charmer. He could do that. But I admire them very much. They were working very hard, and they were volunteers too. And
Absolutely.
they weren't there to fight or throw bombs. They were there to help refugees on the beaches.
Yeah. In my opening, I'd suggested that you bring that lyricism of the poet to Greece's humanitarian disaster. And I was actually thinking quite specifically of the idea of almost like lyric and lyric experience. If I could offer this, the German idealist philosopher Hegel describes lyrical experience as subjectivity, or the eye of a lyrical poem coming to consciousness of itself through experience and reflection. And your passages on the death of your mother, which come throughout the book in 2001, alongside the news coverage of 9/11, a kind of collective social trauma, really surge up in the text as you're processing the trauma of the refugees landing at Lesvos. Was this experience, was the book a way of working through an experience of personal loss for you, almost a kind of hero quest for yourself in terms of going through this?
You know what? It might have been. I try to write in a really unconscious way. I've likened it to driving without ever looking in the rearview mirror, and with headlights pushing only a couple hundred feet ahead into the darkness. I don't really know where I'm going. I don't know what's behind me, and everything you say might be true. I want to leave a lot of mystery in everything I write, unless I'm writing polemically. If I thought of writing about my experience polemically, just saying this is what's happening in Greece, this is why we have to do more to change the situation there. If I was writing something like that, I wouldn't want there to be any mystery. I'd want to just say exactly what I'm saying and try to persuade my audience. With a poem, a short story, a novel, or in this case, a kind of a memoir, I don't want to know what I'm saying. I want the story to sort of find that out for me. I'm discovering the story in the telling. So I can't say for sure. I mean, one of the reasons I went to Lesvos is I thought my limited grasp of Greece might make me helpful as a translator, as a liaison between local authorities um, and the refugees, but it didn't. The refugees couldn't speak English, and my Greek turned out to be woefully inadequate because Greeks speak really fast in Greece. They don't. It's not like reading a book. Um, I also discovered when I was there, and it was a shock to me. The shock wasn't the discovery. The shock was, well, let me just explain. I saw a plaque which mentioned that almost 100 years earlier, about 1 million Greek refugees, Asian Greek refugees fleeing Turkey, had come through Lesvos along exactly the same vector as the refugees. And I knew that among them would have come a few of my own distant relations because of some of the names in my family. And I must have known that when I made the decision to go, that distant relatives had come as refugees about 100 years earlier. And yet, until I saw that plaque, I hadn't even thought of it from the moment I made my decision until I was there. And I thought it must have been there in the back of my mind. So again, I guess this gets back to the idea that trust the unconscious can help you make the right decisions. And it may also help you, write the way you need to write and discover this journey you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example. Really great example too of that unconscious process. I think sometimes you call it night thoughts or the night mind in your writing. One character, of course, we've talked about some of the tragedies, but there's some comedic characters as well. I really liked Pericles. Right in the middle of a scene, there would be a description of somebody just falling flat, and it's because this character Pericles, a security guard, has done a leg kick or a leg sweep, I should say,
Yeah.
or put somebody in a headlock. You seem to have a real affection for Pericles. Could you talk about this character and how he makes it into the story?
Pericles was a wonderful guy, and I don't remember his actual name now. I changed all the names, right?
Yeah.
To, in some cases, to protect people who are in trouble with the authorities. I actually, this is the terrible thing about fictionalizing in this way. I don't remember what Pericles' real name was, but he was this burly bodyguard, about 5'8", 240 pounds, martial artist. And he took me down a couple times. I was just standing there in the camp, around 11 o'clock. And suddenly, whoa, I'm just down on the ground with my face out pushed up against the gravel like that. And Pericles says, you see how hard, Stavros, you see how hard it would be for anyone to come into the camp and harm any of the refugees. So he was very devoted. He was the bodyguard, and he knew there were some right wingers in town, like Golden Dawn people, who hated the refugees. And so we did have the feeling there had to be a bodyguard. And Pericles took it very seriously, and he was constantly practicing on volunteers just by ambushing them. Sort of like Cato in the Pink Panther, if you remember that character is always attacking the Clouseau character.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate how well stitched together all the stories of the volunteers are, and the ways in which they cross paths and they come back. It's just nicely stitched together. Are there any of the were there any volunteers? Well, actually, I should say too that it has a way of humanizing what could be a really inhuman experience when we get to follow and see the personalities as they unfold, the people that you met on the front lines. But I was wondering whether there were any volunteers or any heroic stories that you just couldn't fit into the story that were on the edges, or were you able to capture everybody that might have made that experience what it was for you?
No, I did cut some scenes, and if I could probably I could probably remember them if I sat here for 10 minutes, but I'm not going to do that. Just sit here, sort of like looking upward, trying to remember. But I did cut some scenes. There's some, people who refugees and volunteers who did things that I wanted to bear witness to, and I had to cut stuff. I wanted to make the book really tight. I wanted it to move quickly to give the feeling of how time on Lesvos moved that month.
Absolutely. Are you still in touch with the people that you included in the story?
Some, yeah. The three people to whom the book is dedicated, that would be Omar, who, by the way, I had to change all their names, and he insisted that people never refer to him by his name because he was in trouble with authorities. So then when I checked with him, what do you want me to call you? I'm thinking of calling you Tariq. He said, not Tariq. I choose Omiros, a Greek name, because I now consider myself Greek. And I said, Omiros is exactly like Omar. Everyone will know who you are. He says, doesn't matter. So anyway, where was I? I've totally lost my train of thought.
Staying in touch with them, yeah.
Staying in touch, yes. I am in touch sometimes with him. He kind of disappears sometimes for long periods. Then he surfaces and we exchange emails. But definitely with Tracy, who is Lindsay in the book, who yeah, speaking of heroic, she did a tremendous job. Honestly, I think she had PTSD the whole time she was there. But she just wouldn't leave until but she managed it really well, and she did a great job, and she wouldn't leave until there was a break in the action and she could leave. She was an amazing person. And Clara, who was the oldest of the volunteers, I think she's 75 now, and in Albania right now. And yeah, I've kept in touch with them. Not anyone else. I knew dozens of people, maybe 100 people while I was there, but I've kept in touch with those three.
Yeah. In contrast to the volunteers, you also train a keen eye, and you mentioned it in the passage that you read on the NGO groups that arrive in Lesvos to address the refugee crisis. And as you mentioned, there were, I think, 70 at the time that you were writing. So your depiction of the dynamics between the refugees, the volunteers, and the NGO groups has a great deal to teach us about the dysfunction sometimes of international crisis management and the treatment of the refugees and asylum seekers in Europe. There's one moment in particular on the pier at Petra where you're forced to wait for one of the volunteers, I think it was Lindsay, to fetch the right forms to register everybody as they come aboard. And due to Byzantine restrictions, the NGO workers and the local authorities wouldn't let you give them food or water. And I think you describe it a barely helpful neophyte stuck between a cartoon of weaponized authority and a patronizing functionary. I wonder, did this experiences like that leave you disillusioned about our ability to help vulnerable populations? And I use that word disillusion very meaningfully because I'm going to ask a bit about the book that you just published too on disillusionment.
At times I did feel disillusioned, and as I said, I felt like a helpless neophyte in that situation. There were NGO workers. The woman on the pier at Petra was being, unpleasant in all sorts of ways, baby talking to the refugees. You get on bus here, that sort of thing, which is, you don't talk to adults that way, or even children for that matter. even if they can't speak your language. But at the same time, I became aware that she was really stressed and unsure of herself. She wasn't a natural leader, but she was trying to boss people around. So I was able to feel compassion for her. I have to say, though, that some of the NGO reps, the ones who looked like they were, the higher ups, were behaving like the carpetbagging civilian contractors attached to, corporations like Halliburton that go into, war-torn countries after the fact to exploit, to exploit the country when it's on its knees. And some of them were acting that way. They'd walk into restaurants in a big group and they all talked in really loud voices and they just laughed a little too loudly. I mean, in my opinion, when you're in another country, first of all, you don't act that territorial. It's rude to people in the country. It's especially rude when you're there to help, hundreds of thousands of exhausted hypothermic refugees. So they just didn't seem to be where they actually were. It was almost as if thought they were in a boardroom in Toronto or New York. Uh, then there were NGO workers who seemed to really hadn't been disillusioned themselves and still cared enough about what they were doing. They were still there trying to actually be of service. So.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask a couple of big picture questions, but if people anticipating, if they want to ask questions as well, we do have the Q&A button as well as the chat open to ask some questions. So start thinking of questions as I ask Steven a few more questions here. Now, one of the things that I found fascinating as well is because the book takes place in 2015, there are references by various American expatriates to the US election that would take place in 2016. So, and there's a Bernie Sanders supporter, and I think your neighbor at Electra's mentions that she has some fear that Donald Trump may win. So the period between your experience in Greece and the period of the publication of the book has this, well, it's a very interesting 4 years in the world's history that took place, the disruptive orange man in the big white house. Uh, he has roiled not only domestic politics but also international politics.
Yeah.
Given how things have evolved from that time to now, how do you feel about the world's ability to respond to the situation in Greece and elsewhere, given the context of where we're at? Has your perspective shifted? How has it changed as we've come to where we are right now?
I wish I could say something uplifting at this point, but I'm just going to be honest. No, I feel like the situation there, just like the situation in Israel, Palestine, is what I refer to as a tragedy of intractables.
Mm.
Uh, I don't see, I don't think that refugee exflux from the Middle East is going to stop anytime soon. Alas, I don't see Europe reopening its borders and taking millions more refugees. So Greece is just, as usual, Greece is going to muddle along and do its best. And it's a desperate situation. I know you're not supposed to say, I'm supposed to be more uplifting, but I don't feel that way. And um, one one person who said she'd be attending tonight, Smaro Camborelli, wonderful writer and academic. She wrote to me earlier today and said she was glad that my ending had that note of pessimism, acknowledgement of tragedy. And basically what I was trying to do is not offer the reader a life jacket full of bubble wrap or sawdust, fake comfort, fake hope, because the situation is bad. I mean, well, of course, there is still hope. There's still a possibility of fixing things somehow, but we're a long way from that. And right now it's really bad.
Yeah, and I in your afterword you mentioned that we have to find a balance between hope, which can be a distraction, and hopelessness, which can lead to inaction or even nihilism. In another book out this year, and I wanted to mention this, The Virtues of Disillusionment, everyone should pick this book up as well. You cite the Buddhist philosopher Thich Nhat Hanh, who argues that hope can actually be negative because it's based on illusion, a speculative promise that
Yeah.
may distract us from the potential of action and change. In light of that insight, and in light of what your reflections on where we're at, how do we dwell in that space between hope and hopelessness? Can we dwell in that space in a kind of a vibration between the two positions?
Well, I hope this isn't, an impertinent or frivolous comparison, because I'm going from talking about a true crisis to, writing a book. That's not a crisis. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work in the end, in the greater scheme of things. But what I try to do when I write, I know I'm going to abandon half of what I start writing. So I'm trying to write with a desire, but without hope. So I'm going to work hard every day, but without hope, in the sense that I'm not going to be looking into the future and saying, I hope this works out. I'm going to get up every day and work on it and say, it might work or it might not, but I'm doing my best. This is all you can do. So I guess that is a kind of active hope, you could call it. That's like an engaged hope, as opposed to a speculative hope or an idle hope where you just sit back and say, well, I hope it works out. I don't feel like writing today, but maybe tomorrow. And it'd be really nice if this book, if I actually finished this book and people liked it. That's an example of idle hope, and we're all guilty of that. I am too. I waste lots of days when I just don't feel, out of fear and lethargy, I don't feel like engaging. And working without hope is hard. But I think in terms of this vast crisis, as a collective, that's what we have to do now. We have to not hope ourselves into the future, because we have to just actually work with the desire to make a change, rather than sort of speculation that it can happen.
Yeah, great. A question that we have in the chat here: which NGOs are the most effective in this situation? And that's from Eileen Scott.
Well, let me just say that I can't answer definitively, because I didn't encounter all the 70 NGOs when I was on the island, and I was only there for 30 days, right? So take my take on this with a grain of salt. I like the MSF NGO volunteers and the paid MSF people. They were working really hard. The Hellenic Red Cross, the Greek Red Cross, I thought were excellent. In my limited experience, they were doing a great job. These were doctors who were volunteering their time to the Hellenic Red Cross. So it was an NGO, but they were volunteer workers. UNHCR, I disliked some of the reps. I found them kind of arrogant and bossy. They treated volunteers like menial workers and just bossed us around, even though that wasn't how the chain of command worked. We weren't working for them. But they did provide a lot of really helpful infrastructure. So that's important to acknowledge too. Not necessarily great, friendly, touchy-feely folks, but they were providing the sleeping tents and the mats, and that was helpful. So, it really varied. If I thought more, I could think of some other. There was a Norwegian one called Drop in the Ocean that was also doing a great job. Yeah, so there were definitely, I'm not the person to ask because I was there for a month.
Yeah, great.
But that's the best I can do by way of an answer.
Brilliant. Nancy Graham has a question. Has Stephen had discussions with other writers who have described experiences working with displaced persons, refugees? And there's a couple of examples here. James Malaskalik, MD, author of 6 Months in Sudan. So have you had a chance to chat with other writers?
No, I haven't. I know of those writers and those books, but I haven't actually been in touch with them or talked to them.
Yeah. A question also from Nancy Graham. Did you seek or did you find mental health support when you returned to Canada? Was that something that you needed when you finished your experience in Lesvos?
No, I didn't. I've been in some really, in my life, some stressful situations, and I've never done it, and I'm not sure whether I actually should, and whether it's just the way I was raised, never to ask for help of that kind, that it's a sign of weakness. And please note, I'm acknowledging that that's not necessarily a good thing. But the answer is no, I didn't do that. I felt very moved by what I'd seen, and but I didn't feel traumatized myself. The memories keep coming back as flashbulb memories, which are supposed to be a sign of PTSD, but I don't think I was traumatized. No, I don't. Some of the people who had been there for longer, and especially in October when a lot of refugees died right on the pier in Mithymna, definitely had PTSD. I think some of them didn't even know it, but it seemed quite obvious to me, even as someone who doesn't really understand PTSD very well. It looked to me as if they really needed help.
Yeah, Wonderful. And Samaro is in the chat and had, I think this is just a remarkable, wonderful comment. It's an incredible book, one of the very best narratives about refugees and humanitarian issues, not romanticizing, not setting out to lay blame. And thanks for answering the question I had of why use Mithymna instead of Molivos. So that's a very generous remark.
Aristopoli.
Terrific. And actually had a remark too, and I think it was something that I said of Greece's humanitarian disaster. You're absolutely right. It's not just a Greek disaster. It's everyone's disaster. Human rights abuse anywhere in the world is a human rights abuse everywhere in the world.
And we have a big refugee problem here in Canada right now, overlapping refugee problems involving homeless people, different populations, different homeless populations all over the country, and they've grown since the beginning of the pandemic. Here in Kingston, there was at least one large encampment, about not a kilometer from where I'm sitting right now. One thing that I felt when coming back from Greece, I became more aware that you don't have to go to Greece to involve yourself in homeless issues. They're here in a big way.
Yeah, and Samaro's remark also reminds me of something that you say in The Virtues of Disillusionment about you have this wonderful way of finding words that pack so much meaning. In this case, it's a German word, an agglutinated word of Lebenslüge, of life lies. Can you tell us about that in light of this and how Canada might have some complicity with a kind of a Lebenslüge when it comes to these issues?
Yeah, well, the Lebenslüge, or life lie, is literally the lie at the heart of your life that you build your life around. Well, when I looked into my own heart, I realized there wasn't just one Lebenslüge. There were Lebenslügen, like a number of them, all kind of overlapped, like a Venn diagram of little life lies that I was building my life around. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We all do it to a certain extent as we try to sort of, pass and get through our lives without, well, I won't go into detail about it, but the thing is, I decided to talk about Lebenslüge as Lebenslüge also as a national, as a collective phenomenon. And I thought, okay, what's the American Lebenslüge? Obviously, it's we're the greatest nation on earth. American exceptionalism. The British one is that our empire was slightly more, well, no, not slightly, way more, compassionate, humane, and spreading great British things all over the world. We were better than the other empires. The Canadian life lies that we're the nice people, that we never, committed any of these atrocities, genocides, and so on. We compared to the Americans, we're better. We never had an empire like the British, and but it's a lie. And like any lie, it's convenient in that it allows you not to change yourself. You just go on saving the appearances and living the way you want to live, which is the way you always have lived, because that's the path of least resistance. So as Canadians, we do have this lie at the heart of our lives as a nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the position of disillusionment, as you describe it, is that's how it becomes a positive when you face some of these circumstances.
Right.
And it might seem that disillusionment is a negative term, but there's a positive that arises from that experience.
Yeah, well, I just did the math, and it struck me that dis is a negative word. Illusion is generally construed as a pejorative term too. You put two negatives together, you should get a positive. And I thought, well, it is positive. Being disillusioned means you're freed of your illusions, you're freed of your life lies. That can only be a good thing. So I asked myself, why is it we always construe disillusionment as a bad thing? And it can only be because it's so painful, and we don't actually want to lose our life lies. We don't want to see the truth. And that's true on an individual level, and certainly true of countries. I mean, look, the United States is in huge turmoil right now, partly because increasingly it's being forced to face its life lie.
Absolutely. Question. Thank you, Stephen, for your compassion and witnessing. Nancy Graham says, what are your future plans?
Well, right now I'm trying to finish a book of poems and selected poems for next year, and also I'm working on an album of all things, a record album, a first album at the age of 59, which is crazy. And as of tomorrow or the day after, we're releasing the first single, which is a sort of reply to Leonard Cohen. It's called 2020 Cohen's Future. And it's basically a kind of updating of Cohen's famous song, The Future, from 1992.
That's brilliant. Absolutely. Um, great. Oh, it's a comment. Hey, Stephen, met you at Sage Hill. This is Anne Lazurko. Anne Lazurko.
Right? Hey,
Hope to receive your book in the mail soon and share it with my daughter, who spent 6 weeks on Lesvos shortly after you were there. She was not working with refugees, but doing research for a master's thesis. She was, however, struck by the refugee situation and was deeply affected her.
wow. Thank you. That's amazing.
Absolutely. Let's see. Oh, it's a Kingston comment. I actually had one potential last question for you to perhaps end off on here, unless there's other questions in the chat. Near the end of the book, you write, everyone gets away with certain things for a while, but no one gets away with everything forever. But if our illusions, the cherished ones above all, are harmful, isn't disillusionment a good thing, a necessary correction so painful that our word for it is negative? Nobody ever changes until they have to. And we've talked about this a bit already, just now. But I did want to ask, as a final question, from the experience of writing this book, has it left you in a state disillusioned, in a state of disillusionment, writing this book?
I guess the neatest answer would be to say yes, absolutely, and that'd be a great way to end the talk. But I think the truth is the last 5 or 6 years of my life have probably gradually enacted the kind of change you're talking about. And partly it was what I saw in Lesvos, which really helped reprioritize my own values. And it was a very helpful reminder how privileged and luxurious my life is, even as a full-time writer. I mean, I'm not a wealthy guy by Canadian standards, but I am by almost any sane standard wealthy and lucky and privileged. And it was really good to be reminded of that. That's only one small aspect of the change. But what I saw in Lesvos and the heroism, the very human heroism that I described among the refugees and volunteers was deeply inspiring. The thing I keep quoting when I talk about the last 5 or 6 years and why I've come back to music, which is where I started before I began writing. I was writing songs 35 years ago. John Prine sings in one of his many great songs, the heart gets bored with the mind and it changes you. That's the line I keep quoting now. And so certainly being on Lesvos was part of that process. And I think writing the book, of course, grappling with that material must have been part of it too. But my goal ultimately is not to change my own heart and mind, it's to reach readers. And one of the reasons I tried to deploy those techniques of reenaction to make you feel like you're right there in the camp and on the beach is I want people to know what it's like and what I saw and what I felt. I could have written a long polemical essay, but I don't think I'm good at changing people's minds that way. I'm hoping this will do it.
That's brilliant. I know it's something that someone must say often, but you are one of our favorite guests at the Words Festival. Stephen is one of the most generous writers to work with. Every time there's an opportunity to bring you, we wish physically to London, but virtually, just a wonderful evening to talk to you about your new book. I want to thank everybody who came and asked great questions and stayed with us, and for Stephen for staying over. We've taken you over the hour that we said that we were going to have with you, so I really appreciate your generosity. It was a real honor to talk to you about this really important book, and I hope everybody goes out and buys the book. Visit the Biblio-Oasis site to pick up your copy of the book. It's an important read, and it's absolutely critical in terms of addressing some of the issues that face us right now. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Josh.
Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.